It is the last week of April, 1945. A German soldier stands at the edge of a forest somewhere east of the Elbe River. His boots are worn through. His uniform is caked with mud that has not been wet for days. He has not slept in 48 hours. Behind him, perhaps 20 kilometers away, the ground shudders with the sound of Soviet artillery. He can feel it through the soles of his feet. Ahead of him, across open fields and a strip of highway choked with refugees and abandoned carts, lies the Elbe River, and on the other side of that river are the Americans. He does not hesitate. He runs. This is not a single story. In the final weeks of World War II, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and millions of German civilians made the same desperate calculation. East meant capture by the Red Army. West meant surrender to the Americans or the British. For an enormous number of men, that was not a difficult choice. It was the only choice that offered any real prospect of surviving the war at all. Understanding why requires going back to the moment when the Eastern Front collapsed in a way that no one in the German High Command had dared to imagine. On January 12, 1945, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front opened the Vistula, Oder offensive from the Baranów-Sandomierz bridgehead in occupied Poland, striking the southern flank of German Army Group A. 2 days later, on January 14th, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front launched its own assault from the Magnushow and Puławy bridgeheads further north. Together, the two fronts committed approximately 2.2 million soldiers, 4,529 tanks, and 13,763 artillery pieces against German Army Group A, which was commanded by Colonel General Joseph Harp, and held by roughly 400,000 men spread across a front of hundreds of kilometers. The German troops defending the bridgehead sectors were outnumbered by ratios that made the outcome mathematically foreseeable before a single shot was fired. The German line did not bend. It shattered. Warsaw fell on January 17th. Krakow fell on January 19th. By January 31st, Soviet armored spearheads had reached the Oder River at Kustrin, a position only approximately 70 kilometers from Berlin. The entire advance had covered roughly 500 kilometers in under 3 weeks. It was the fastest large-scale land advance of the entire European war. German Army Group A, renamed Army Group Center on January 25th, had been functionally destroyed as a coherent fighting force. Entire divisions were cut off, overrun, or simply ceased to exist on the order of battle. The speed of the collapse made it impossible for the civilian administration in the affected areas to respond in any organized way, even if it had wanted to. Towns that had received no warning at all found Soviet tanks in their streets within days of the offensive beginning. Local party offices that had been assuring their residents as recently as January 10th that the front was stable and the Reich was holding, were overwhelmed before they could even formulate a message to the contrary. The bureaucratic machinery of the Nazi state, which had functioned with grinding efficiency for 12 years, simply could not move fast enough to deal with what was happening. And in the space that opened between what the system said and what the soldiers and civilians could see with their own eyes, the great westward movement began. At the same time, a separate Soviet offensive to the north, the East Prussian offensive, launched on January 13th, drove toward the Baltic coast. By January 23rd, Soviet forces had cut the land route connecting East Prussia to the rest of Germany. Millions of German civilians were suddenly trapped behind enemy lines, with Soviet armies advancing toward them from the east and south. These were not people who had been warned. They had not been permitted to evacuate. Several Nazi Gauleiters, regional party leaders who controlled civilian authority, had declared that any preparations for flight amounted to defeatism and were punishable by death. When the front collapsed in January and February of 1945, the civilian population of East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia found themselves caught between that murderous bureaucratic inertia and the advancing Red Army. The party officials who had forbidden them to leave were in many cases among the first to flee, climbing into cars in the night while those they governed scrambled behind them on frozen roads. To understand what those civilians feared, and what every German soldier on the Eastern Front feared alongside them, you have to go back to October of 1944. The village of Nemmersdorf, in East Prussia, became the first German civilian settlement to fall briefly under Soviet control. On October 21, 1944, troops of the Soviet 2nd Battalion, 25th Guards Tank Brigade crossed the Angarap River and held the village for roughly 2 days before a German counterattack retook it. When German forces returned, they found evidence of civilian killings. The Nazi propaganda ministry, under Joseph Goebbels, immediately organized a site inspection and broadcast the findings through German newsreels and newspapers. Images were shown in cinemas across the Reich. The propagandists inflated and in some cases staged what the cameras showed, shaping the story for maximum effect on a German audience already brittle with war weariness. Modern research by historian Bernhard Fisch has confirmed 23 civilian murders in Nemmersdorf itself, and another 38 in nearby villages. The propaganda machine distorted and exaggerated what had happened, but it could not invent the fundamental truth that killings had taken place. And regardless of what the newsreels showed, German soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front did not need Goebbels to tell them what the consequences of Soviet occupation might mean. They had been on that front for 3 years. They had seen what the German army had done to the Soviet people. They understood, many of them with the clarity of personal guilt, what kind of reckoning was now travelling west behind the advancing armies. The German army had invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941 and conducted a campaign that would eventually stand as one of the defining atrocities of the 20th century. Soviet prisoners of war had died by the millions in German captivity, deliberately starved in open field camps in the first year of the war alone. Entire villages had been burned. Jewish communities across the occupied territories had been systematically murdered. The Soviet Union had lost approximately 27 million people by the war's end, a catastrophe so vast that almost every family in the country had been touched by it directly. The soldiers marching west in the spring of 1945 were not abstract military assets. They were men who had been part of all of that. Some had participated directly, others had watched. Others had simply been present, wearing the uniform of an army that had done these things. They knew what the Soviet soldiers behind them were carrying with them. And they knew, with a clarity that required no explanation, that the consequences of that history were now travelling westward at the speed of advancing tank armies. The soldiers of the Red Army, who now marched into Germany, were not, individually, without humanity. Many were young men who had lost brothers and fathers and entire villages to the German advance. But the violence that accompanied the Soviet advance into East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia was documented extensively by investigators in the years that followed, and it was real. Mass violence against civilians was recorded across dozens of locations. The scale and nature of what occurred confirmed for every German soldier who heard the reports exactly what he had feared, and it accelerated the race west in ways that no order from any headquarters could have achieved. The result was a mass psychological transformation. East Prussia had previously seen very little of the fighting. Civilian life, though strained and rationed, had continued in a kind of enforced normalcy. Within weeks of January 1945, that normalcy collapsed entirely. An estimated 8.5 million Germans began moving west in one of the largest involuntary migrations in human history. Roughly 450,000 people crossed the frozen Vistula lagoon on foot, in horse carts, in any vehicle that could be forced onto the ice. The lagoon was a body of water roughly 90 kilometers long, separating the East Prussian coast from the Vistula Spit, and in the winter of 1945, it was the only overland route still open to those trying to reach the evacuation ports at Pio and Danzig. The ice was not always reliable. Carts broke through. Horses drowned, pulling their loads under with them. Children froze to death on the open crossing as temperatures dropped far below freezing at night. Soviet aircraft attacked the columns on the ice periodically, strafing lines of civilians who had nowhere to shelter and nowhere to run. Survivors later described the route across the lagoon as marked by the bodies of those who had not made it, lying where they had fallen because no one had the strength or the time to move them. Those who reached the port towns found conditions that were barely better. Pillau and Danzig were receiving hundreds of thousands of refugees at the same time as they were handling military operations. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Supply lines had broken down. The ports themselves were under intermittent bombardment. People waited in the cold for ships that were not always large enough, or fast enough, or that sometimes did not arrive at all. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz understood what was happening. On January 23, 1945, he issued the order that set in motion Operation Hannibal, the largest seaborne evacuation in history. Using every available naval and merchant vessel in the Baltic, the German Navy would attempt to move as many civilians and soldiers as possible from the collapsing eastern ports to safety in Germany, Denmark, and western ports, still under German control. The operation would last until May 8, 1945, running across 106 days through some of the coldest and most dangerous waters in northern Europe. Rear Admiral Konrad Engelhardt coordinated the fleet under the overall command of Admiral Oskar Kumetz. At least 14 large former passenger liners participated, along with hundreds of freighters, naval escort vessels, trawlers, and any craft that could carry people across the freezing Baltic. Between January and May of 1945, the operation moved an estimated 800,000 to over 1 million civilians and approximately 350,000 military personnel. It was the largest naval evacuation in the history of maritime warfare, dwarfing Dunkirk in scale if not in the collective memory of the West. The price was catastrophic. On January 30th, 1945, the former cruise liner Wilhelm Gustloff departed the port of Gotenhafen, now the Polish city of Gdynia, carrying an estimated 10,000 or more people. The ship was designed to carry little more than 1,900. Wounded soldiers were packed into the empty swimming pool. Civilians filled every corridor, every lounge, and every space where a human being could stand or sit. The Baltic was bitterly cold, the sea rough, and Soviet submarines were operating in those waters. At approximately 9 in the evening, Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, fired 3 torpedoes. All 3 struck the Gustloff. The ship listed immediately and began to sink. The water temperature was close to freezing. Lifeboats were insufficient, and in the chaos many could not be launched at all. Of the estimated 10,000 or more aboard, approximately 9,343 perished. That figure represents the highest single ship death toll ever recorded at sea, more than 6 times the number who died when the Titanic sank. It remains almost entirely unknown outside Germany and the historical community, eclipsed in public memory by a dozen less deadly disasters. Marinesko struck again 10 days later. On February 9th, the same submarine sank the transport General von Steuben, which was carrying wounded soldiers and refugees across the Baltic. Of the more than 4,000 people aboard, only around 300 were pulled alive from the water. On April 16th, Soviet submarine L-3, commanded by Captain Vladimir Konovalov, torpedoed the transport vessel Goya near the northern tip of the Hel Peninsula. The Goya had approximately 6,700 people on board. 183 survived. The ship sank in under 10 minutes, pulling thousands of people under before they could reach the surface. Despite these catastrophic losses, Operation Hannibal succeeded in moving the vast majority of those who reached the Baltic ports. Donitz later claimed that approximately 99% of those who boarded ships reached safety. That claim is broadly supported by the historical record, which stands in stark contrast to the overland route, where deaths from cold, starvation, violence, and exhaustion ran into the hundreds of thousands. For those who did reach safety, the journey across the Baltic was an experience that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Survivors described ships so packed that movement between decks was impossible, the smell of unwashed bodies and fear, and diesel fuel mixing in spaces never designed for this kind of use. Children separated from parents in the crush and reunited hours later, or not at all. Old men and women who had farmed the same East Prussian land for 60 years, sitting on the decks of warships, staring at a coastline disappearing behind them, watching the smoke from burning towns on the horizon. They had left everything. What they carried with them was their lives. And in the winter of 1945, that was enough. While the naval evacuation pulled people from the coastline, the land situation continued to deteriorate in a way that forced German commanders to make choices that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The most consequential of these decisions was made by a 44-year-old General der Panzertruppe named Walther Wenck, who became in the final days of the war the commanding officer of the German 12th Army. Wenck had a reputation as one of the Wehrmacht's most capable and forward-thinking generals. He had served as Chief of Staff of Army Group South Ukraine and was considered by Heinz Guderian, the former Chief of the Army General Staff, to be among the most gifted operational officers in German service. In February of 1945, Wenck had been severely injured in a road accident, fracturing his skull and breaking 5 ribs. He was still recovering when he was recalled to command on April 10th, 1945, handed a newly assembled army, and given a mission that even the most optimistic officer in the German High Command could see had almost no chance of success. His 12th Army was not a formation in the traditional sense. It was a collection of improvised divisions assembled from whatever men and material could be gathered in those final weeks. Two of them, the Theodor Korner and the Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, were built from the Reich Labor Service. The Ulrich von Hutten and Scharnhorst divisions were drawn from officer cadet schools. Together with other fragments, stragglers, and partial units, they held a sector along the Elbe River, from roughly Wittenberg in the north to Leipzig in the south, facing the Americans to the west. On April 22nd and 23rd, Adolf Hitler ordered Wenck to turn his army east, push through Soviet lines, and relieve the Berlin garrison. He was to link up with General Theodor Busse's 9th Army, which was being encircled east and south of Berlin by Zhukov's and Konev's forces. The combined force was then supposed to drive into Berlin and break the siege. Wenck assessed this order with the cold clarity of a professional soldier who understood the operational reality far better than the man issuing commands from a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Relieving Berlin was not possible. The distances were too great, the roads too congested, the Soviet forces too powerful. Busse's 9th Army was trapped in a pocket near the forests around Elbe, southeast of Berlin, and was being destroyed by continuous Soviet pressure from all sides. The 9th Army had entered the encirclement with approximately 80,000 men. It would emerge with perhaps 25 to 30,000, and only then because of what Wenck chose to do next. He turned his army east, not toward Berlin, but toward the pocket where the remnants of Busse's force were fighting for survival. He opened a corridor and held it long enough for tens of thousands of soldiers and a vast column of civilians to pour through it toward the Elbe. It was not what Hitler had ordered. It was what the men on the ground needed, and Wenck knew the difference. By early May, Wenck's 12th Army was marching west around the clock, soldiers and refugees moving together in a column that stretched for kilometers. Officers who survived the war later recalled feeding more than 250,000 refugees daily from military rations intended for a fraction of that number. The column included old men pushing handcarts, mothers carrying children too exhausted to walk, wounded soldiers who had been carried out of the Elbe pocket on improvised stretchers. It was not a military formation anymore. It was a people trying to reach a river. Among those young soldiers in the column was an 18-year-old enlisted man named Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who would decades later serve as the foreign minister of West Germany for many years, one of the longest tenured foreign ministers in German history. He was not an officer in those days, just a teenager in a Wehrmacht uniform, moving west like everyone else. He never forgot those roads. The men coming out of the Elbe pocket were in a condition that shocked even hardened soldiers. They had been encircled by 2 Soviet fronts and had fought their way out through forest and swamp under continuous artillery fire for days. What emerged from the trees south of Berlin was something closer to a desperate human current, men who had shed everything that slowed them down, who had kept moving because stopping meant capture, and capture meant everything they had seen and absorbed across 4 years on the Eastern Front. The corridor Wenck held open was not wide and it was not safe. Soviet forces pressed on both flanks throughout the breakout. The road ran northwest through the forests and then across open ground to the river, and every kilometer was contested. When Soviet pressure threatened to close the route entirely, Wenck's soldiers held the flanks long enough for the last columns to pass. Wenck made contact with the United States 9th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General William Simpson, whose forces held the western bank of the Elbe, near Tangermunde. An arrangement was reached. Between May 4th and May 7th, with part of the Tangermunde bridge destroyed and the crossing managed under increasingly desperate conditions, an estimated 25,000 soldiers from Busse's 9th Army and up to 250,000 civilians crossed the Elbe and entered American custody. Soviet forces arrived at the eastern bridgehead and shut the crossing down. Some men who had marched for days and survived the breakout from Elbe were turned back at the river's edge, within sight of the western bank. Wenck himself crossed on the final boat on May 7, 1945. The story of the men who did not make it tells the other side of this calculation. The Elbe Forest Cemetery today contains over 28,000 German war dead, making it the largest World War II war cemetery in Germany. And the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge continues to find and rebury remains in those forests every year. Many of those graves hold men who were within reach of the Elbe but ran out of time or road or luck. To understand why the race west mattered so desperately, the raw arithmetic of prisoner survival must be confronted directly. German soldiers who surrendered to the Western Allies had roughly a 1% chance of dying in captivity. The Americans held approximately 3.4 million German prisoners by the end of the war in Europe. The number who died in American custody was a small fraction of that total. The situation for German prisoners in Soviet custody was categorically different. The West German government commissioned a comprehensive study of prisoner of war records in the 1970s, known as the Maschke Commission. It concluded that of approximately 3,060,000 German military personnel taken captive by the Soviet Union, approximately 1,094,000 died in captivity, a death rate of approximately 35 to 36%. More recent scholarship places the confirmed figure closer to 1 million, but the order of magnitude is not in dispute across serious historical work on this subject. This was not an abstraction in the spring of 1945. It was personal knowledge that moved through every German unit on the Eastern Front. The fate of the soldiers captured at Stalingrad was one of the most widely known facts in the German military. In February of 1943, approximately 91,000 German troops surrendered to Soviet forces following the destruction of the Sixth Army. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus laid down his command in a ruined department store basement and walked into captivity. His men followed him into a world that most of them would never leave. Of those 91,000 men, only approximately 6,000 ever returned home to Germany. The rest died in Soviet camps across the years that followed, of cold, hunger, disease, and the accumulated exhaustion of captivity. The Soviet camps were not built to house prisoners comfortably. They were built to extract labor from men expected to work until they could no longer stand. Germans captured in the early years of the war died at particularly catastrophic rates. Men slept on bare ground in the first winters. Food was calibrated to the work performed, which meant that sick and injured men received less food than those who were stronger and therefore weakened faster. The cycle was not accidental. Even in the later years of the war, when conditions in some camps had marginally improved, the death rate remained far higher than in Western Allied captivity. German prisoners were used to rebuild the infrastructure their own army had destroyed during the advance into Russia. They worked in coal mines, in forests, on construction sites across Siberia and Central Asia, in conditions that were often extreme and sometimes lethal. Letters home were censored or simply did not arrive. For the families waiting in Germany, the silence stretched on for months, then years, then in many cases indefinitely. A family that received no word had no way of knowing whether their father or son was alive in a Soviet camp, dead in a Soviet camp, or lying in an unmarked grave somewhere on the road between Stalingrad and the Oder. That uncertainty was its own particular form of suffering. West German records show that well over 1 million families filed missing person reports with the German Red Cross for relatives last known to be in Soviet custody. Many of those files remained open for decades, some never resolved at all. The families of German POWs who died in Soviet captivity often received no official notification. The Soviet government simply did not send death certificates for foreign prisoners. A man who died of typhus in a camp outside Minsk in 1946 might not be formally declared dead by a German court until the 1960s or 70s, long after his widow had remarried and his children had grown up without him. The last German prisoners held in Soviet captivity were released in 1955 and 1956, following West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's trip to Moscow in September of 1955, during which he negotiated the release of the final approximately 10,000 German prisoners still held in the Soviet Union. These men had been prisoners for 10 years after the end of the war. In Germany, their return was called Die Heimkehr der 10.000, the return of the 10,000. Wives who had assumed themselves widows for a decade were reunited with husbands they had last seen as young men, who were now grey and worn. Children who had been infants in 1945 met fathers for the first time as adults, in reunions that required both parties to become acquainted from the beginning, carrying between them the weight of an absence that neither of them had chosen. German soldiers in the spring of 1945 did not know the precise numbers, but they knew the reality. They had fought on the Eastern Front. They had heard enough to understand what Soviet captivity meant. And the Western Allies, despite genuine hardships in their own prisoner camps during the overwhelmed weeks following Germany's surrender, operated within a broadly recognizable framework. German prisoners in American custody were processed, fed, held in fixed facilities, and in most cases released within a few years of the war's end. The system was imperfect, but it was not designed to consume the people placed inside it. This difference shaped the decisions made in the final weeks in ways that cut across all conventional military logic. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring oversaw a managed withdrawal and eventual surrender in western and southern Germany. General Johannes Blaskowitz surrendered German forces in the Netherlands to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. On May 4, 1945, at Lüneburg Heath, Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg and General Hans Kinzel signed the partial surrender, covering more than 1 million German troops in the Netherlands. Northwestern Germany, the Frisian Islands, the island of Heligoland, and Denmark, they passed into British custody. Within days, those men were being processed through prisoner-of-war facilities. Within months, many were being repatriated. Within a couple of years, the great majority were home. Norway, where a German garrison of approximately 350,000 men had spent years in relative quiet far from the main fighting, surrendered to British forces under General Sir Andrew Thorne on May 8 and 9. General Franz Bohme, commanding German forces in Norway, carried out the surrender in an orderly fashion. Those men were repatriated within a year or two of the war's end. They walked back into their lives. Their families were waiting. Denmark, where another large German force had been stationed throughout the occupation, surrendered to British forces at the same time as the northwestern Germany capitulation. Across Scandinavia and the Low Countries, the pattern was the same. German soldiers laid down their weapons, entered British or Canadian custody, endured a period of prisoner-of-war internment, and returned to Germany in a condition that, while often difficult, left them alive and eventually free. The contrast with what happened to German forces in Czechoslovakia demonstrates exactly how much the direction of surrender mattered. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner commanded Army Group Center in Bohemia and Moravia, a force of approximately 900,000 men. Schorner was notorious for ordering the summary execution of soldiers he deemed to be failing in their duty. Even in the final week of the war, with the surrender already signed, he continued. Men were hanged from trees by roadsides for infractions invented by officers who had no battlefield left to command. The discipline Schorner enforced was the discipline of a man who could not accept that the war was ending. And then, on May 8, 1945, Schorner boarded an aircraft and flew to Austria, where American forces captured him on May 18. His 900,000 men were left behind. The great majority surrendered to Soviet forces and did not return to Germany for years. Many did not return for a decade. The unconditional surrender happened in 2 stages, each shaped by the same desire to buy time for men to reach Western lines. On May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed the General Instrument of Surrender at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France, at 2:41 in the morning. The surrender was to take effect at 23:01 Central European Time on May 8, 1945. The instrument was then ratified in a formal ceremony at Berlin-Karlshorst just before midnight on May 8. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed for Germany. Marshal Georgy Zhukov signed for the Soviet High Command. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, acting as deputy to General Eisenhower, signed on behalf of the Allied Expeditionary Force. American General Karl Spaatz and French General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny signed as witnesses. Even after Jodl signed at Reims, German units continued to move west across the night of May 8 and into May 9, with Soviet forces closing behind them. Some crossings continued past the deadline. Others were turned away. A German soldier who missed the crossing by hours had not simply been unlucky. The last act of this extraordinary chapter happened in a place no strategic planner would ever have chosen for it. Schloss Itter, a 19th-century castle perched on a hill approximately 666 meters high near the town of Wörgl in the Austrian Tyrol. They had been serving since the spring of 1943 as a subcamp of the Dachau concentration camp system. Its prisoners were not ordinary people. They were some of the most prominent French political and military figures of the preceding decade, held as what the SS termed honor prisoners. Among them were former Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, who had represented France at the Munich Conference in 1938. Paul Reynaud, who had succeeded Daladier as Prime Minister and presided over the catastrophic French defeat of 1940, General Maxime Weygand, the former Commander-in-Chief of French forces, General Maurice Gamelin, Weygand's predecessor in command, Léon Jouhaux, one of the most influential labor leaders in French history, Jean Borotra, a four-time Grand Slam singles champion in tennis and one of the most recognized sportsmen in France, François de la Roque, a right-wing politician, Michel Clemenceau, son of the Great War leader Georges Clemenceau, Marie-Agnès Caillot, the sister of Charles de Gaulle, and the diplomat André-François Poncet. These people despised each other with the particular intensity of French political life. Reynaud and Daladier had been bitter enemies for years, their rivalry predating the war itself. Weygand and Gamelin held each other in contempt. They ate at separate tables and argued constantly. They had in common only their imprisonment and their wish to survive it. On May 4, 1945, the castle's SS commandant, Sebastian Wimmer, fled. He left the prisoners, the castle, and its small remaining garrison without orders or authority. Armed SS units were moving through the surrounding area, and those units had reason to ensure that no prominent prisoner survived to testify about what had been done. A Yugoslav handyman named Zvonimir Kukovic left the castle to seek Allied forces. The castle cook, Andreas Krobot, made contact with a German Wehrmacht officer named Major Josef Gangl in the town of Wörgl below the castle. Gangl had been working quietly with the Austrian resistance movement in the Wörgl area, preparing for the end of the war. When Krobot reached him with the news about Schloss Itter, Gangl drove toward the American lines under a white flag. At the town of Kufstein, Gangl made contact with First Lieutenant John Lee of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. Lee was a young American tank officer whose war had brought him across southern Germany to this corner of Austria. Gangl explained the situation at the castle. He explained who was imprisoned there. He explained what was coming for them. Lee decided to act. He assembled a small force, his Sherman tank, 14 American soldiers, Gangl, and a small number of German artillerymen under Gangl's command. A Waffen-SS officer named Kurt Siegfried Schrader, who had been convalescing from wounds in the area and had already made contact with the prisoners, also joined the defense. On the morning of May 5, 1945, approximately 100 to 150 Waffen-SS troops attacked Schloss Itter. They brought machine guns and at least one 88mm artillery piece, which in the early minutes of the battle destroyed Lee's Sherman tank and left the defenders without their armor. The situation was serious, and the defenders were significantly outnumbered. Americans fired from the battlements alongside German troops who had been their enemies days before. General Weygand, the former Commander-in-Chief of France, helped operate a machine gun from the castle walls. At a critical moment, Jean Borotra vaulted over the castle wall, dropped to the ground outside the perimeter, and ran through the SS lines in his own clothes, heading down toward the valley below and the Allied forces that might be somewhere within reach. He survived the run. He found the relief column from the 142nd Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division. Among the Americans with that column was a 22-year-old French-Canadian war correspondent named René Levesque, who would decades later become Premier of Quebec. Levesque recognized Borotra immediately. Borotra was given an American uniform to wear, and he guided the column back up to the castle. Relief arrived and the SS attackers were driven off. Approximately 100 SS soldiers were taken prisoner. Joseph Gangl was killed by a sniper's bullet during the battle while physically moving Paul Reynaud out of the line of fire. He was the only defender to die that day. The French prisoners were evacuated that evening and reached Paris on May 10, 1945. They had survived the war. They went home. Gangl was posthumously declared an Austrian national hero. A street in Wörgl still bears his name. John Lee was promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The Battle of Castle Itter on May 5, 1945, 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender took effect, is recognized by historians as the only confirmed instance in World War II in which American and German soldiers fought together as allies against a common enemy. It happened because a Wehrmacht officer drove under a white flag toward men who had been his enemies. It happened because an American lieutenant chose to act on what a former enemy told him. The war was ending, but it was ending in ways that no doctrine had prepared anyone for, and the men who navigated those last days did so without any map that covered the territory they were crossing. The broader context of that final spring also included one of the most visually charged moments of the entire war. On April 25, 1945, patrols from the American 69th Infantry Division moving east from the Mulde River made contact with soldiers of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division at the Elbe River near the town of Torgau. The two armies had met in the middle of what had been the Reich. First Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue's patrol made the first confirmed contact near the town of Strela at approximately 11:30 in the morning. A staged photograph followed 2 days later, showing Second Lieutenant William Robertson and a Soviet lieutenant named Alexander Silvashko shaking hands on the broken remains of a bridge over the Elbe. The image became one of the most widely reproduced photographs of the end of World War II in Europe. What that link-up meant on the ground was that Germany was now cut in two. The northern pocket, around Flensburg and Denmark, was separated from the southern pocket in Bohemia and Bavaria. German formations that had hoped to make their way west through central Germany now found their path blocked. The clock that had always been running against them was running faster. For the soldiers in the east who had not yet reached the Elbe, the news of Torgau, when it filtered through, carried a meaning that required no military training to understand. The door was still open, but it was getting smaller. A young soldier named Joseph Pulowski was present at Torgau that day, a member of Kotzebue's patrol. He spent the rest of his life attempting to have April 25th declared a World Day of Peace, returning to Germany as often as he could, speaking about what he had witnessed, and believing that the meeting of those two armies at that river had meant something that the subsequent decades had failed to honor. When he died, he was buried at Torgau, in Germany, because he had asked to be laid to rest at the place where he believed, for a few hours on that spring afternoon, the world had briefly held open a different possibility. The war in Europe ended officially at 23:01 Central European Time on May 8, 1945. Dönitz and the remnants of his government were arrested at Flensburg on May 23, formally ending the last pretense of German governmental authority. The race was over. Some had made it, some had not. To put the scale of the reckoning into human terms, the Halb Forest Cemetery, where the remnants of those who died in the breakout from the pocket lie buried, today holds over 28,000 German war dead. The Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgraberversorgung continues to find and re-inter remains in those forests every year. New identifications are still made, names still restored to men who died anonymously in the last days of a war that had already been decided. The Baltic seabed holds the wreckage of the Goya, the Wilhelm Gustloff, the General von Steuben, and dozens of other vessels of Operation Hannibal, and within them the remains of tens of thousands of people who died trying to do the same thing the soldiers on land were trying to do, which was reach the West before the war consumed them. Some of the German soldiers captured by the Soviets in those final weeks were not freed until 1955 and 1956. They had been young men when they surrendered. They came home as middle-aged strangers to families that had learned to live without them, to children who had grown up not knowing them, to a country whose borders had shifted and whose map no longer matched the one they remembered. The phrase the Germans used for their return carried everything that needed to be said: the return of the 10,000. As if those men were ancient soldiers coming home from a campaign on the edge of the known world, which, in a sense, is exactly what they were. A German soldier who missed the crossing at the Elbe by a matter of hours had not simply been unlucky. He had been condemned to a decade in Soviet captivity, while men who crossed the same river on the same night were repatriated within a year or two. The difference between crossing and not crossing was not a matter of fighting skill or courage or military bearing. It was a matter of timing, of position, of which path through the collapsing front had remained open long enough to use. That arithmetic, brutal and simple, is what drove hundreds of thousands of men through the forests and across the rivers of a disintegrating empire in the spring of 1945. Not ideology. Not orders from above. Not any of the grand abstractions of the war that had brought them to those roads. The calculation was smaller and more fundamental than any of that. It was about which set of men was waiting on the other bank, and what they would do with you when you arrived. The Elbe is a quiet river today. Pleasure boats move along it in summer. The bridge at Torgau has been rebuilt, and the town around it has the look of any mid-sized German river town, orderly and unhurried, with no obvious sign of what happened there in the spring of 1945. Every April 25th, a small ceremony is held at the riverbank to mark the meeting of the American and Soviet armies. Fewer people attend each year as the last living witnesses to that spring grow old and pass away. The history belongs to the next generation now, to people who know it only from documents and photographs, and the testimony of those no longer here to give it. What remains is the forest at Elbe, where volunteers still search, and the graves still being filled. And the river, which keeps moving regardless, carrying the same cold water north toward the sea that it has always carried, past a bridge that was rebuilt, past a town that was rebuilt, past the place where two armies met, and a world that had been one thing briefly became something else, before settling into the long, complicated shape of what came after. The men who ran toward that river in the spring of 1945 are almost all gone now. What they chose to do, and what was done to those who did not make it in time, belongs to history. But history only keeps what someone chooses to remember, and that choice in the end falls entirely to us.